He saved her life in the river that morning, but by sunset Caleb Walker would realize that saving a stranger in Apache country was never a simple act of kindness. The storm had rolled down from the red Arizona hills without warning, the kind of desert storm that turned a quiet stream into a roaring brown river in less than an hour. Caleb had been riding fence along the northern edge of his small cattle range, counting posts and watching the clouds gather like dark horses across the sky. Then he heard it. Not thunder, not wind. A human cry carried across the rushing water. At first he thought the storm was playing tricks on him, but the cry came again, sharp and desperate. Caleb pushed his horse through the mesquite and reached the riverbank just as he saw her. A young native woman struggling in the current, her dark hair whipping across her face as the swollen water tried to pull her downstream. The river was nearly 20 yards wide now, moving fast enough to carry fallen branches and chunks of red clay past the rocks. Caleb didn't stop to think about who she was or where she came from. He swung out of the saddle and plunged into the cold water, boots and all, fighting the current step by step until he reached her. She was slipping beneath the surface when he caught her arm. The fabric of her buckskin dress was soaked and heavy, dragging her down as the river pulled at both of them. Caleb tightened his grip and turned toward the bank, forcing his way through the rushing water inch by inch. For a moment he thought the river might win, but his boots finally found solid gravel, and he dragged them both onto the muddy shore. The storm wind pushed through the canyon, carrying the smell of rain and wet leather as Caleb knelt beside her, breathing hard. The young woman coughed and pushed herself upright, water dripping from her hair and sleeves. Her eyes opened slowly, dark and alert despite the shock of the river. Caleb expected relief, maybe gratitude. Instead, she stared at him as if something terrible had just happened. Her gaze dropped briefly to the torn edge of her dress where the river and his grip had ripped the soaked leather while he pulled her from the current. She clutched. The fabric closed with both hands, her breathing quick and shallow. Caleb followed her eyes, confused. "You're safe," he said quietly, the wind carrying his words across the bank. But the woman shook her head, not in anger, not in fear of him, in fear of something else entirely. She turned her head toward the ridgeline above the river, where the rain clouds were beginning to break apart under the late afternoon sun. Caleb looked up too, squinting against the fading light. At first he saw nothing except the long shadows of the canyon walls stretching across the rocks. Then he noticed movement along the ridge. One figure, then another, and another, still as stone, watching from above. The young woman's voice came out barely louder than the wind. "You should not have touched me," she whispered, her English careful but clear. Caleb frowned, still trying to understand what she meant. "I pulled you out of a river," he said. But the woman shook her head again, eyes fixed on the silent shapes along the ridge. "My people saw," she said softly. The wind carried a distant sound across the canyon then, low and hollow like a horn echoing through the desert. Caleb didn't know the meaning of that call yet, but the woman beside him did. And the look in her eyes told him one thing with absolute certainty. The river had not been the real danger today. The sound that echoed through the canyon did not fade quickly. It rolled along the stone walls and across the swollen river like a warning carried by the wind. Caleb Walker stood slowly, water still dripping from his coat, his eyes moving from the ridge back to the young woman beside him. She had not taken her gaze off the figures above. There were more now. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. The storm clouds were beginning to break apart, and the late Arizona sun slid between them, lighting the ridge with a pale copper glow. From that height the watchers looked like shadows carved into the stone. Caleb counted 5 at first. Then he noticed others farther back along the ridge. 10 perhaps, maybe more. It was hard to say in the fading light. None of them carried their weapons raised. None of them shouted or rushed down the canyon wall. Their stillness was more unsettling than noise. Caleb brushed the mud from his hands and glanced again at the woman he had pulled from the river. She had stepped away from him now, carefully holding the torn edge of her dress, closed with one hand while the other rested against a rock to steady herself. Her breathing had slowed, but her eyes remained fixed on the ridge above. "They are just watching," Caleb said quietly, more to himself than to her. If they meant trouble, they would already be riding down. The woman turned toward him then, her expression calm but serious, as if she were listening to someone who did not yet understand the rules of the land he stood on. They do not ride, she said softly. They wait. Caleb frowned slightly. The wind pushed through the canyon again, carrying the smell of wet dust and sagebrush across the bank. His horse shifted nervously behind him, hooves scraping against the gravel. The animal had noticed the watchers too. You said your people saw? Caleb said. Saw what exactly? The young woman lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. They saw you pull me from the water. Caleb shrugged lightly. That is not much to see. She lifted her head again and looked directly at him. It is enough. Her voice carried a quiet certainty that made Caleb glance once more toward the ridge. The figures had not moved. They remained spaced along the rock line like silent markers against the sky. Caleb had spent most of his life in the frontier territories. He understood enough about Apache lands to know when he was standing somewhere he did not fully belong. Still, something about the situation puzzled him. If they were worried about you, he said, they would have come down by now. The woman shook her head slowly. They are not deciding about me. The words settled into the air between them like dust drifting through sunlight. Caleb looked at her again, studying the calm seriousness in her eyes. Then who are they deciding about? The woman hesitated only a moment before answering. You. Caleb let out a quiet breath and glanced once more toward the ridge. The figures above had begun to shift now, not moving quickly, but stepping forward one by one toward the narrow trail that wound down the canyon wall. From this distance their movements were quiet and measured, the kind of steady approach that carried purpose rather than anger. The young woman watched them begin their descent and then spoke again, her voice almost lost in the wind. My name is Ayanna, she said. Caleb nodded slowly, his eyes still on the descending figures. Caleb Walker. Ayanna looked at him with the same calm seriousness she had shown since the moment she opened her eyes on the riverbank. Caleb Walker, she said quietly. You should understand something before they arrive. Caleb finally turned his attention fully back to her. What is that? Ayanna held the torn edge of her dress closed and glanced once toward the ridge again where the first of the watchers had reached the narrow trail. Then she looked back at him. When a man saves the life of a woman from my tribe, she said carefully, the story does not end with the river. Ayanna's words settled between them like the quiet after thunder. Caleb Walker watched the narrow trail along the canyon wall where the first figures were already descending, moving with the kind of steady balance that only came from people who had walked that land their entire lives. The sun was dropping lower behind the western ridge now, turning the wet rocks along the riverbank a deep shade of red. The storm that had filled the river was already drifting away, leaving the air cool and sharp with the smell of sage and damp earth. Caleb rested one hand lightly against the saddle of his horse, more to calm the animal than himself. The horse's ears remained pinned toward the descending figures. Animals understood things long before men did. Caleb looked back at Ayanna. She had stepped a few feet farther from the river now, standing on a patch of dry gravel where the sunlight reached her shoulders. The torn edge of her dress was still clutched carefully in one hand, but her posture had changed. She stood straighter now, as if the presence of her people gave her strength again. You said the story does not end with the river, Caleb said quietly. Ayanna nodded once. In my tribe, she said, choosing her words slowly, when a man touches a woman to save her life, he becomes part of the story that follows. Caleb gave a faint half-smile. Out here we usually just call that helping someone. Ayanna did not smile back. My people do not see it that way. Caleb glanced toward the trail again. The first of the watchers had reached the lower rocks now, stepping down the slope with patient, measured movements. There were more behind them. What had looked like a handful from the ridge was becoming something larger. Caleb counted again and stopped at nearly 20. They carried bows across their backs and wore long feathered braids that shifted slightly in the evening wind. None of them hurried. None of them spoke. They simply continued down toward the riverbank as if following a decision already made. Caleb folded his arms loosely across his chest and leaned against the saddle horn. Your people move quietly, he said. Where I come from, a group that size usually makes a lot more noise. Ayanna watched the approaching figures without turning her head. Noise is for men who want to frighten someone, she replied softly. My people prefer to understand first. Caleb studied her expression. There was no fear there now, only a calm certainty that made him curious about what she had meant earlier. You said they are deciding about me, he said. What exactly are they deciding? Ayanna did not answer immediately. The first warrior reached the bottom of the trail and stepped onto the riverbank, his moccasins barely disturbing the gravel. He stood there for a moment, looking across the water and then toward Ayanna and Caleb. One by one the others arrived behind him, spreading out along the bank in a quiet line. The river rushed past them, swollen from the storm, but the sound of the water seemed distant compared to the silence that now filled the canyon. Caleb straightened slightly and adjusted his hat. 20 pairs of eyes were now studying him with calm attention. No one raised a weapon. No one shouted a challenge. The stillness carried the weight of a conversation that had not yet begun. Ayanna finally turned toward Caleb again. The last light of the setting sun touched her face, and for the first time since the river, she looked almost peaceful. "They are deciding what a man must do," she said quietly, "after he saves the daughter of their chief." The words settled over the riverbank like dust drifting through the last light of day. Caleb Walker felt the meaning of them before he fully understood them. The daughter of their chief. He turned his head slowly toward Ayanna, studying her face as if seeing her for the first time since pulling her from the river. The calm in her eyes had not changed, but now it carried something else as well, a quiet acceptance of whatever came next. Caleb let out a slow breath and glanced back at the line of warriors standing along the gravel. They had spread out in a wide half-circle, leaving the river behind them and the open desert at their backs. Their movements had been careful and deliberate, each man choosing a place along the bank as though the pattern had been decided long before they arrived. None of them spoke. The only sound was the rushing water and the wind sliding through the canyon walls. Caleb had spent enough years on the frontier to know when silence meant more than shouting ever could. He straightened slightly beside his horse and rested both hands on the saddle horn. "You could have mentioned that sooner," he said quietly. Ayanna watched him with the faintest trace of sympathy in her expression. "You did not ask." Caleb gave a short breath that might have been a laugh if the moment had been different. "Fair enough." The warriors along the bank shifted slightly as another figure stepped down the final rocks of the canyon trail. He moved slower than the others, not from weakness but from a kind of steady confidence that did not require haste. His hair was braided with strands of gray and dark feathers, and the leather across his shoulders carried markings that spoke of many seasons in the desert sun. The other warriors turned their heads slightly as he approached, their quiet attention settling on him the way the wind settles over the land before nightfall. Caleb did not need anyone to explain who the man was. Some things were clear without words. The older man walked forward until he stood a few yards from Ayanna and Caleb, his boots pressing softly into the damp gravel beside the river. His eyes moved first to his daughter, studying her carefully from head to toe as though measuring the truth of the story he had been told. Ayanna lowered her head respectfully, but did not step back. The man's gaze lingered for a moment on the torn edge of her dress, then shifted slowly toward Caleb. The look was not angry. It was thoughtful, the kind of look a rancher might give a horse he had never seen before, judging its strength and spirit before deciding what came next. Caleb met the man's eyes and gave a small respectful nod. Out here, a man learned quickly that respect traveled farther than pride. The older man finally spoke, his voice calm and deep enough to carry easily over the sound of the river. "My daughter tells me you pulled her from the water." Caleb nodded once. The river was moving fast. The man studied him for another quiet moment. "Many men would have stayed on the bank." Caleb shrugged lightly. "Many men are smarter than me." For the first time a faint smile touched the older man's face, though it disappeared as quickly as it came. He turned briefly toward the warriors behind him, then back toward Caleb. The sun had nearly slipped behind the canyon ridge now, and long shadows stretched across the gravel. When the man spoke again, his voice carried the calm weight of someone used to being heard. "I am Tashunka Red Elk," he said, "chief of the Red Valley Apache." The wind moved gently through the canyon as the words settled into the evening air. Caleb adjusted the brim of his hat and nodded again. "Caleb Walker," he said simply. The chief's eyes rested on him for a long moment before he spoke again. "You saved the life of my daughter," Red Elk said. "That is a thing our people do not forget." Caleb felt the quiet attention of 20 warriors settle over him once more. The chief's next words came slowly, like the beginning of a story whose ending had already been written somewhere far beyond the riverbank. "But among my people," Red Elk continued, "a man who becomes part of such a story must also walk the path that follows it. The chief's words lingered in the cooling air like the final notes of a drumbeat fading across the valley. Caleb Walker felt the weight of them even before he knew exactly what they meant. Around them the canyon was growing darker as the sun slipped behind the western ridge, leaving a deep red glow along the horizon. The swollen river rushed past the gravel bank, its muddy water reflecting the fading light like dull copper. 20 warriors stood, in silence behind their chief, their calm attention fixed on the stranger beside the horse. Caleb shifted his stance slightly, resting one boot against a smooth stone near the river's edge while keeping his hands loose on the saddle horn. Years on the frontier had taught him that moments like this were not solved by quick words or nervous movements. They were solved by patience. Chief Tashunka Red Elk studied him for several quiet seconds before continuing. His expression held neither anger nor praise. It held the calm seriousness of a man speaking about something older than either of them. The river chose this moment, the chief said slowly. And you chose to act. Caleb gave a small nod. The water was rising fast. Anyone close enough would have done the same. Red Elk shook his head gently. No. Many men watch danger and tell themselves it is not their place. The chief turned his head slightly toward Ayanna. She stood a few steps behind him now, the wind brushing through her dark hair as the last light touched the canyon walls. My daughter's life belongs to the Great Spirit, Red Elk continued. But the moment between the river and the shore belonged to you. Caleb listened carefully, sensing that the conversation was moving towards something larger than a simple thank you. I did what seemed right, he said quietly. The chief nodded once, acknowledging the answer. Then his eyes moved again to the torn edge of Ayanna's dress that she still held closed with careful hands. The wind stirred the loose fabric gently, and the gesture carried meaning deeper than Caleb yet understood. The warriors behind the chief remained perfectly still, their quiet presence forming a wide circle that separated the small group from the rest of the canyon. Even Caleb's horse had grown calmer, standing with its head lowered as if recognizing the stillness around them. Red Elk finally stepped one pace closer, the gravel shifting softly beneath his boots. His voice remained calm, but the tone carried the weight of tradition. Among my people, the chief said, a man who pulls a woman from the hands of the river does more than save her breath. Caleb tilted his head slightly, listening. He touches her life. He changes her path. The wind swept down the canyon again, carrying the distant scent of rain from the departing storm. Caleb glanced briefly at Ayanna. She was watching her father with quiet attention, as though she had heard these words many times before. In your towns, Red Elk continued, perhaps a man rides away after such a moment and the story ends. The chief shook his head slowly. For us, the story only begins. Caleb rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Stories are good things, he said, but they usually do not decide a man's future. The chief's eyes met his again, steady and thoughtful. In our tribe, Red Elk replied, some stories do. The warriors shifted slightly behind him as the final glow of sunset faded into deep twilight. A few small stars were beginning to appear above the canyon ridge. The chief lifted one hand slowly, not as a threat, but as a signal that carried meaning among the men behind him. They stepped forward together, closing the circle slightly around the riverbank, their movements calm and controlled. Caleb remained still beside his horse, watching the formation with the careful attention of someone measuring the shape of the moment. Red Elk lowered his hand again and spoke once more, his voice quiet but unmistakably clear in the evening air. You have shown courage by saving my daughter, he said. But courage alone does not finish this story. Caleb looked at the chief with calm curiosity. Then what does? Red Elk's gaze moved briefly toward Ayanna and then returned to Caleb. Choice, the chief answered. And the path a man chooses when the river has already brought him to the edge of it. The chief's last words settled into the canyon like the quiet weight of night itself. Choice. Caleb Walker rolled that word slowly through his mind while the river continued its restless rush beside them. The sky above the red cliffs had darkened to deep blue now, and the first real stars were beginning to appear between the fading storm clouds. The warriors of Red Valley Apache stood in their wide circle, their silhouettes steady and silent against the dim light of evening. No one hurried the moment. Out here in the desert, time moved differently. Caleb shifted his hat back slightly, and looked at Chief Tushunka Red Elk with the calm expression of a man who had learned long ago that listening was often more powerful than speaking. "You keep talking about paths," Caleb said quietly, "but you have not told me where this one leads." The chief regarded him with thoughtful patience. The wind moved softly through the canyon, carrying the faint scent of damp sage and river mud across the gravel bank. Red Elk folded his hands loosely in front of him, the gesture slow and deliberate. "When a man pulls a woman from the river," he said, "he steps into the circle of her life." Caleb glanced briefly toward Ayanna. She had moved closer now, standing a few yards behind her father. The torn edge of her dress still rested carefully beneath her hand, though the fabric had begun to dry in the evening air. Her eyes were calm, but there was a quiet watchfulness in them, as if she already knew where this conversation was leading. Caleb returned his gaze to the chief. "Where I come from," he said, "saving someone from drowning usually earns a handshake and maybe a cup of coffee." A faint ripple of amusement passed across Red Elk's face, though his voice remained steady. "Among my people, a life debt is never so small." Caleb rested one elbow against the saddle horn and studied the chief carefully. "I did not ask for a debt." Red Elk nodded slowly. "Debts given by the river are not chosen." The chief lifted one hand slightly and gestured toward the water rushing past the rocks. "The river carries many things. It carried this moment to you." Caleb followed the gesture, watching the dark current slide between the stones. The sound of the water had become almost steady now, like a distant drum beneath the quiet voices of the canyon. He had spent enough time on the frontier to recognize when a conversation was moving toward something important. "So tell me," Caleb said calmly, "what path are you talking about?" Red Elk looked toward his daughter again. The chief's expression softened for a brief moment, the way a father's eyes sometimes did when the world grew complicated around those he cared for. Then he turned back to Caleb. "In our tribe," Red Elk said slowly, "when a man saves the life of an unmarried woman, the spirits believe their paths have touched for a reason." Caleb raised one eyebrow slightly. "Spirits believe a lot of things." The chief did not react to the comment. "Sometimes that reason is simple gratitude," he continued. "Sometimes it is something greater." Ayanna finally stepped forward from behind her father, the gravel shifting softly beneath her moccasins. She stood beside Red Elk now, her voice calm but direct. "The river did not just bring you to me," she said quietly. Caleb looked at her, waiting. Ayanna held his gaze without hesitation. "It brought you into the law of my people." The wind stirred the canyon again, brushing softly through the feathers of the warriors behind them. Caleb felt the quiet weight of 20 pairs of eyes resting on him. "And what does that law say?" he asked. Ayanna glanced briefly at her father before answering. Red Elk spoke first, his voice steady and unmistakably clear beneath the rising stars. "It says that a man who saves the daughter of a chief must decide whether he will walk away from our story," the chief said, "or step forward and become part of it." The chief's words drifted across the darkening riverbank, carried by the steady rush of water and the quiet breath of the canyon wind. Caleb Walker remained still beside his horse, feeling the weight of what had just been said settle slowly into the moment. Above them the sky had turned deep blue, and the first bright stars were now scattered across the open desert sky like distant lanterns. The circle of warriors remained steady and silent, their presence forming a calm boundary around the small space where Caleb, Ayanna, and Chief Tushunka Red Elk stood. Caleb tipped his hat back slightly and studied the chief with the thoughtful look of a man trying to measure the shape of an unfamiliar road. "You make it sound simple," Caleb said quietly. "Walk away or step forward." Red Elk nodded once. "The hardest choices are often simple ones." Caleb glanced toward the dark water sliding past the rocks. For a moment he said nothing, listening to the sound of the river that had started all of this. Then he looked back at the chief. "And if a man chooses to walk away?" The chief's eyes remained steady. "Then he rides away with our thanks," Red Elk said. "The story ends at the riverbank, and our paths separate like two trails crossing the desert." Caleb rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "That sounds reasonable enough." Ayanna had been watching quietly, but now she spoke, her voice calm and clear beneath the rising stars. "But the story does not end for me." Caleb turned toward her. She met his gaze without hesitation. "In my tribe," she said, "when a man saves the daughter of a chief, The moment becomes part of her life forever. The wind lifted a strand of her dark hair as she continued. If you ride away, the people will still speak of the man who touched my life and left the path unfinished. Caleb let out a slow breath. That sounds like a heavy story for a stranger to carry. Red Elk studied him carefully before speaking again. That is why there is another path. Caleb already suspected what was coming, but he waited for the chief to say it. Red Elk gestured gently toward Ayanna. A man who chooses to step forward does not carry the story alone, the chief said. He becomes part of the family whose life he saved. The words settled quietly into the night air. Even the river seemed softer for a moment as Caleb considered them. You were talking about marriage, Caleb said finally. Red Elk did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at his daughter, then back at Caleb. Among my people, the chief said calmly, a man who saves a woman from the river may choose to walk beside her from that day forward. Caleb gave a small shake of his head, though there was no anger in the gesture. Only disbelief. You realize we met less than an hour ago. A faint smile touched Ayanna's lips for the first time since the storm. The river does not measure time the way people do. Caleb glanced at the warriors around them. 20 silent witnesses beneath a sky filled with stars. Then he looked again at Ayanna. She was watching him with a calm patience that made the moment feel strangely steady. Not forced, just waiting. Caleb rested both hands on the saddle horn and stared out across the dark water for several seconds. Finally he spoke. And if a man is not sure which path belongs to him? The chief's answer came without hesitation. Then he listens to the truth in his own heart, Red Elk said. Because the river has already brought him to the place where that truth must be spoken. The canyon had grown completely quiet except for the steady rush of the river and the faint whisper of wind. Sliding through the rocks. Caleb Walker stood beside his horse with his eyes fixed on the dark water moving through the narrow bend below them. The night sky above the red cliffs had opened wide, filled now with bright desert stars that seemed close enough to touch. Around him the warriors of Red Valley Apache remained still, their silhouettes steady beneath the starlight as they waited without impatience. No one pressed him for an answer. Out here in the desert, a man was given the space to hear his own thoughts. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck slowly, letting the cool night air settle around him. The whole thing had begun less than an hour earlier with a storm and a rushing river. Now 20 warriors and a tribal chief stood waiting to hear what kind of man he truly was. Caleb let out a quiet breath and finally looked up again. His eyes moved first to Chief Tushunka Red Elk, then to Ayanna standing beside him. She had not moved since the question had been placed before him. Her posture was calm, her gaze steady, as if she understood that the next words would shape more than just this moment beside the river. Caleb stepped away from the saddle and walked a few slow paces toward the water. Gravel shifted softly beneath his boots. The river carried the smell of wet clay and storm runoff as it pushed past the rocks in the darkness. He stopped near the edge and watched the current for a moment before speaking. Where I come from, Caleb said quietly. People believe a man should never let a storm decide the direction of his life. The chief listened without interrupting. Caleb glanced down at the water again. But tonight it feels like the river had a different idea. A faint smile touched Red Elk's face, though he said nothing. Caleb turned and looked at Ayanna again. The starlight reflected faintly in her dark eyes. She did not look away. You said the river does not measure time the way people do, Caleb said. Ayanna nodded once. It only moves forward. Caleb considered that for a moment, and then chuckled softly under his breath. That might be the most honest thing I have heard all day. He stepped back toward them, stopping a few feet from the chief. The circle of warriors remained steady, their quiet attention resting on him without pressure or expectation. Caleb rested his hands on his belt and met Red Elk's gaze. I have spent most of my life riding alone across this country, he said. A man gets used to the idea that his path belongs only to him. Red Elk inclined his head slightly. And now? Caleb glanced briefly at Ayanna again before answering. Now I am standing beside a river that brought me somewhere I did not plan to be. The chief waited patiently. Caleb took one more slow breath of the cool desert air. You asked me to choose whether I walk away from your story, he said, or step forward into it. Red Elk nodded. Yes. Caleb looked around at the silent warriors, the dark river, and the open sky above the canyon. Then he spoke again, his voice steady and clear. A man who saves someone from a river probably should not pretend the moment means nothing. A faint ripple of understanding moved through the circle of warriors, though no one spoke. Caleb finally turned fully toward Ayanna. "If your people believe our paths touched for a reason," he said quietly, "then maybe the river knew something I did not." The wind moved gently across the canyon as Caleb Walker finished the thought that had been forming since the moment he stepped into the rushing water. "So, I will not ride away tonight." The canyon held its breath after Caleb Walker spoke those words. The river continued its steady rush through the rocks, but everything else seemed to pause as if the desert itself were listening. The warriors of Red Valley Apache stood silent beneath the wide sky, their dark outlines unmoving in the starlight. Chief Tashunka Red Elk studied Caleb carefully, the same thoughtful expression still resting on his weathered face. For several long seconds no one spoke. The wind drifted slowly through the canyon walls, carrying the distant scent of wet earth left behind by the storm. Finally the chief nodded once, a slow deliberate movement that carried quiet approval. "The river brought you to this place," Red Elk said calmly, "and now you have chosen how to stand within its story." Caleb shifted his weight slightly and glanced toward Ayanna. She had been watching him with that same steady patience from the moment he stepped away from the saddle. Now something new had appeared in her expression. Not surprise, not relief, something softer, something that belonged to the quiet understanding that sometimes followed difficult choices. Red Elk turned toward the warriors behind him and lifted one hand gently. The men stepped back a few paces, the circle opening like a gate beneath the stars. Their movements remained calm and respectful, as though acknowledging the decision that had just been made beside the river. The chief then looked again at Caleb. "A path shared by two people does not begin with grand words," he said. "It begins with small steps taken together." Caleb nodded slowly. "That sounds about right." A faint smile touched the chief's face. He gestured toward the rising trail that climbed out of the canyon and disappeared into the darker hills beyond. "Our camp lies 3 miles east of this river," Red Elk said. "The fire will still be burning when we arrive." Caleb looked toward the trail for a moment and then back toward his horse. The animal snorted softly as if ready for the journey. Caleb rested one hand on the saddle and glanced once more at Ayanna. 3 miles is not much of a ride," he said quietly. Ayanna stepped forward, the gravel shifting softly beneath her moccasins. "Some journeys are measured in miles," she replied. "Others are measured in choices." Caleb gave a small thoughtful nod. Tonight might be both. The warriors had already begun to move toward the trail, their silhouettes climbing slowly toward the open desert beyond the canyon. Red Elk followed after them with the steady pace of a man who had walked many long paths beneath the same stars. Caleb took the reins of his horse and walked beside it rather than mounting. For the first few steps, he said nothing, simply listening to the night sounds of the desert and the distant voices of the warriors ahead. Ayanna walked beside him in the quiet. After a short distance, Caleb glanced toward her. "Back where I come from," he said thoughtfully. "People like to believe they decide everything about their lives." Ayanna looked toward the starlit sky above the canyon rim. "And tonight?" Caleb chuckled softly. "Tonight a river decided something first." They continued walking up the narrow trail, leaving the rushing water behind them. The desert stretched wide and silent under the endless sky, and somewhere ahead the glow of distant firelight flickered among the rocks where the Red Valley Apache camp waited. Caleb Walker had ridden alone across this land for many years, following whatever trail lay before him. But as he stepped onto the open desert beside Ayanna, he understood something simple and unexpected. Out here in the wide country, sometimes the most important paths were not the ones a man planned to ride. They were the ones the river quietly placed beneath his boots when he least expected it.